you so much for
Awesome.
being here. So Dr. Kristen Liesch is co-CEO and co-founder of Tidal Equality, named a Forbes Diversity and Inclusion Trailblazer. That's amazing, Kristen. Kristen is a strategist and educator with 15 plus years of experience designing transformative curricula, implementing equitable process changes, and capacity building programs to support the design of more equitable organizations in Canada, the US, Europe, and New Zealand. So what a tremendous bio. We're like super fortunate to have you here today. That's amazing. So I'm not going to take up too much of your time. So thank you again for being here, and I'll be back to help you with any questions and just your concluding remarks. So thanks so much again.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for that intro. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to be here today because I just can't wait to bring you some ideas and insight into how it is that in this day and age, you can begin to debias your people practices one question at a time. Before I get into that, I want to let you know a bit more about me. I just had a great intro there from Rachel. I was kind of the professional spiel, but there's a different story between how it is that I got here. It was about 8 years ago now. I was living in New Zealand and I was in the middle of a PhD, and I'd also just had a child. And I was really steeped in the writing of people at the turn of the 20th century, change makers, people who cared about problems of inequality as they were experienced that, nearly 150 years ago. And so in one hand, I was holding their writing, and in the other hand, I was, burping my infant daughter, and something struck me. And that was that the stories I was reading about bias, inequality, discrimination, they sounded all too familiar. They sounded like some of my experiences. They sounded like the experiences of people around me, colleagues, friends, family. And I started asking the question, what is it that we're doing in the world of work primarily to change this story? And why hasn't it changed fast enough? And an example of one of the contemporary stories, in fact, this was something that came to us not too long ago, was an example of this kind of bias, discrimination, and inequality that, again, has been rife in different shapes for a long time. So there's a sales professional. She worked for a fast-growing Canadian tech company, and she had been working there for several years, managing a team. She'd been doing some travel for the company, training in various parts of the world, and an opportunity for promotion came up. So she put her hat in the ring. She really wanted this job. She sat one round of interviews. She sat a second round of interviews, and at the end of the long process, she was told, sorry, we gave the role to someone else. We don't really think you had quite enough experience yet in the business. We, maybe not enough time leading a team, and maybe needed to give a bit more evidence of your chops here. But she went away and she thought about that, and something about it just didn't feel right. She really had weighed her options. She'd looked at her application, and she thought she really had what it took. She was friends with one of the people who were on the decision-making panel, and they happened to find themselves out for a drink. And she said to him, can you just level with me? Like what was it? Like, where was I really lacking? Because I'm really having a hard time trying to figure out what I could have done differently. And he said to her, all right, off the record, you really got to cut your hair. It's long. You look really young. You don't look like somebody who could be leading a team. It's just not professional enough. So it's really, that'd be something I'd recommend. Now, some folks might be a bit floored when they hear this, thinking like, how is it possible that could be the thing, right? We hear this actually in our work or variations on this theme a fair bit. And for some of you, this might not be so unbelievable to hear this. But the fact is that bias and inequality, these things are expressed and experienced in a lot of ways, and they make their way into decision making. The first thing I want to kind of express today is that bias and inequality are facts. They exist in our society. There's no question. And today, I mean, it's more evident than ever. We see how the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated inequalities experienced by certain groups. We've also seen the Black Lives Matter uprising really bring to the fore the problem of racial inequality. And the fact is that these things live in our society, but some folks have a harder time making the leap to admitting, you know, this actually also, it lives in our organizations as well. You know, the doors to our organizations are permeable to the kind of bias and inequality we see in our society. You know, even when you work for an organization you really like and care about, even in organizations that serve a social good, even in organizations full of people that we care about and like working with, bias and inequality live in our society and they live in our organizations. And the other fact is that because bias and inequality live in your organization, it's probably preventing your people, all of your people, from reaching their full potential. And if your people can't reach your full potential, neither can your organization. So what do? Should we try to de-bias people then? Well, this is a question and actually a foundational assumption that's been at the core of diversity and inclusion work since the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement. More than 30 years, we've been trying to de-bias people with things like unconscious bias training or cultural sensitivity training and so on. But the fact is, all of these decades later, we have a lot of research and evidence to show that de-biasing people is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Yet we keep investing in these methodologies. So from our perspective as an organization at Tidal Equality, if we can't de-bias people, especially not in a 90-minute training session, how can we start to de-bias our organizations? And this question is really at the foundation of the work that we do at Tidal Equality. I'm going to give you just a little bit of context there before I dive into some more examples. So we have two methodologies, the WAVE and the equity sequence. The WAVE is a strategic planning methodology, and the equity sequence is a practice that anyone can learn to use in their work to make it less biased, more inclusive. But what's at the core of both of these methodologies and all of our work is an understanding that there is a lot of power in asking the right questions of the right people. We believe fundamentally, and we see this evidenced in our work every day, that people in your organization, their experiences and their perspectives, these hold the key to unlocking the equitable and inclusive potential of your processes. But not only that, your products, your services, the way you serve clients, customers, stakeholders, as well as the way you cultivate a culture for your people. You and your organization can tap into that potential, but it takes curiosity. It takes courage. The courage to ask questions about how inequality is experienced and expressed in your organization. I want you to think, when was the last time that you asked your people to tell you about their experiences of inequality? Now, this is different from asking questions like, how included do you feel here? How much belonging do you feel you have in this place? Asking them about problems of inequality is a little bit different because it requires you to position yourself in a way to go, okay, I'm ready to look under the hood. And we may not find something that makes us very happy when we look under the hood. But again, the fact is you have a lot of potential to solve those problems of inequality if you have the courage to ask questions about how they show up. I'm going to give you an example. We had one of our earliest clients was an international law firm. They suffered from a problem that is common in many law firms, and that is, how do we advance women to partnership? Women associates are hired often at equal, sometimes greater rates than male associates, but those numbers dwindle as we head up the ladder. So this organization brought us in and they said, all right, we kind of think we know what the problem is. We're pretty sure that female associates see a problem with the billable hour. You know, it's pretty cutthroat, it's pretty tough. And they also are likely to want us to give them more work flexibility. And at this point, they said, you know, we cannot touch those things. We can't do anything about that. And we said, okay, we understand that this is how you feel and that this is this is where you see the problem lives. Now we're going to go to the female associates and we are going to listen to and learn from them. So we started with questions. This was a wave process. So this was a strategic design process. Their goal was to come out with a strategy, an equity strategy for advancing women to partnership. So our listening and learning looks a little bit different in this methodology. But we asked, what are the barriers to your advancement here? And we heard a lot of really interesting things from women associates at this firm. But one thing really stood out and provided them with a really clear opportunity to make change. What we heard was, what was important when it came time to be considered for partner was the relationship you had, the personal relationship you had with clients in your book of business. And how did you go about developing those relationships? Well, often it was in really informal business development opportunities, like a golf game or a hockey game or a dinner out. And the associates who got those opportunities were often chosen in a really ad hoc way. You know, a partner's got his tickets to the hockey game and he looks around and he taps the nearest male associate on the shoulder and says, hey, you want to come to the game with the client? And he says, sure. But women were predominantly being looked over for these opportunities. And that was something they saw preventing them from advancing in the firm. And so based on this new insight that was born from the lived experiences of these people who faced this inequality, the organization was empowered to tweak their process. So what comes next after they have this information? One simple change. The partner requests whatever from marketing, hockey tickets, a tea time, a dinner reservation, marketing preps that, and they add one piece of paper, one document gets added when they hand this over. And that's a printout of the billable hours and associates on the client file. So it shows exactly which associates are billing the most hours and which associates maybe should be invited to this event. So it puts the high achievers top on the list so that the partner can make a decision about who should show up based on who's doing the most work for the client. They made one simple change that made all the difference to female associates getting the opportunity to have face time with their clients and build a portfolio and a profile that was much more attractive come decision-making time for partner. That's one example. But what I want you to learn from this as well is that equality and making equity interventions, this is a rising tide that lifts all boats. In this case, we went into the problem related to the experience of women associates, and we came out with a solution that actually was to the benefit of anybody who was working hard on a file. In some cases, that would have been, a male associate who's a little bit of a quiet type, who's got his head down, working hard behind the scenes and not getting recognized for it. With this intervention, this equity measure, it was a rising tide that lifted all boats. Another example of an organization who used questions to improve their processes and make them more equitable. In this case, we used a different methodology. In this case, we trained a cross-departmental team in a West Coast tech company on the equity sequence, which I mentioned before. It's a system of questions that anybody can use as individuals or a team to identify how to reduce bias. And this is done really quickly. And in this case, the process took no more than 45 minutes. But the question on the table was, our promotions process does not seem to be very equitable. We see the same types of people advancing year on year. What's the problem? So we took a good look at the promotions process, what it looked like, what was it made of? And we took this cross-departmental group of people with various perspectives, experiences. They represented different dimensions of identity and diversity. And we taught them the equity sequence questions, and then we looked at the process. So we wanted to listen to and learn from their experiences. And a lot of really interesting things were revealed in the process, and I'm going to share two with you today. The first had actually to do with where a candidate was located, whether they were in the head office or whether they worked remotely or in a satellite office. It had become clear that if you worked in the head office, your bid for promotion was far more likely to succeed. Why was that? Well, the people making the final decision, they were all in the head office. So you had a greater chance of having rubbed shoulders at the coffee table back when we all worked in the office, and of having FaceTime with those decision makers, as opposed to folks who were in satellite regional offices or working from home. So that was one thing that they told us. The next thing we learned was that it made a big difference who your manager was, your relationship with them, and how much time they had on their plates. Folks who had a good relationship with their manager and a manager who felt they had the bandwidth, they got a lot of support and coaching when it came to putting together their application for promotion. They got tips and tricks and insight. You know, the manager had seen other people apply successfully and they brought that insight to bear. So those folks had a really good shot at being promoted. Other people, you know, if they didn't have a great relationship with their manager, or if their manager was really maxed in terms of bandwidth and they couldn't give them that support and insight, they were kind of left on their own. So in this case, it really mattered who was there helping you out or not. These were two areas that were revealed where inequity was really preventing people from achieving their full potential. And with this insight in hand, all of a sudden, the process of promotions could be modified, could be tweaked with equity interventions, with equity measures to make it more likely to allow the advancement of all equally. One way they changed things up was to see that on that final voting panel, there were representatives from satellite offices, that there would be someone on that team who is much more likely to know the candidate on a first name basis, having spent time with them or had conversations with them. That was one small thing. But a bigger intervention in my mind was they decided, you know what, why don't we really tap into all that great coaching and insight that a really engaged manager is giving a promotion candidate, and let's package that and let's make that available to everybody in our organization. Let's put together a resource, make it available online so that when anybody wants to apply for a promotion, they've got all of that great coaching packed into one resource. And that was an excellent intervention for that organization, tailored specifically to the type of inequity that was experienced by the people there. So in this case, what I want you to take away is an understanding that inequality can be experienced and expressed in diverse and sometimes really surprising ways. And what I mean by this is, you know, you might bring in a DEI specialist, someone who specializes in issues of equity and inclusion and diversity, and they can bring a certain lens to taking a look at your processes. I know a lot of organizations today actually are hiring consultants to debias their policies and processes. And someone like me might be able to look at your policies, processes, and some internal data and say, okay, looks like, you know, for example, maybe you're not advancing women equally to men, or, you know, maybe people of color are experiencing barriers, but I'm not going to understand the nature of those problems. But further to that, inequality doesn't just express itself in the way we anticipate. It doesn't just show up in the big picture ways, you know, in regards to race, gender, ethnicity, age, ability, and so on. It can be expressed in intersecting ways and also in ways we may not anticipate. Like in the example I just gave you, there was an inequity for folks who were remote compared to those in head office, an inequity for people who had engaged managers with heaps of time and those who had poor relationships with managers or managers who are really busy. These are not the types of inequities that you're going to know about unless you go direct to your people and ask them the right questions to reveal these opportunities to make things more equitable for all. So I want you to know bias and inequality exist in your organization and its people processes. That is a fact. I want you to know, though, that your people know how that bias and inequality is expressed and experienced. Now, they might not each hold the solution. So I'm not suggesting you say, hey, you know, bring me the problem and a solution. That's how I want to hear it. No, but collectively and collaboratively, when you bring people together, When you have the courage to ask questions about how inequality is expressed and experienced, you are now empowered to uproot bias and inequality in your organization so that everyone can have an equal opportunity to succeed and reach their full potential. Now, we are empowering and equipping organizations all over North America and beyond with the power of questions in our WAVE process, but really excitingly with the equity sequence. And what fires me up about that is that it really empowers the individual. You don't need a specialist in the room with you. All you need is curiosity, courage, candor, empathy, and a desire to make things more equitable. So you can Google the equity sequence, you can find it, you can try it out for yourself. But at the end of the day, I want you to know too that solving these difficult problems of bias and inequality, it is possible. And it can actually be really collaborative and uplifting. It can also be efficient and effective for your organization when you can learn to ask the right questions. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm done my presentation. I'll scooch off of there. So thank you very much.
Hi, Kristen. That was amazing. Thank you very much. So I think we have a question. Do you have a couple minutes for a question?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So someone says, do you think there is inequality when hiring people who live in SES areas?
Could somebody clarify SES?
I don't know what that means either. Low income. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I can bring to this, you know, again, like kind of the expertise perspective and tell you that folks who live in low income areas are going to experience various barriers that I could probably, again, presume things like transportation, possibly access to childcare and healthcare and others. But I can say, yes, it does likely exist. And also you're going to get the greatest insight on how that inequity is experienced by people in those SES areas if you go about asking them. We've had some really progressive organizations in regards to their recruitment and hiring decide, okay, you know, like we're consistently trying to attract and hire people from diverse populations or different experiences and backgrounds and identity, failing to do so. Why is that? We can't figure it out. Go to those people, create an opportunity to tap into their lived experiences and perspectives. Do this in a careful and conscientious way, you know, and that may be something you need external support creating that context for. But when you do that, you're going to understand the targeted problems that you may be able to create a targeted solution for.
Great response. I hope that was helpful. That was very helpful. Thank you. All right. If anyone has any questions, we have a couple minutes left. So if you wanted to throw them in the chat, but so Kristen, your business. So it's when did you start your business?
So I started just under 8 years ago, but Tidal Equality, it went under a brand change just last year. So Tidal Equality is 1 year old. It's just a baby, although we've been operating for several years. We used to be called the Women's Work Institute. And today we're functionally a strategy firm at the intersection of social change and diversity and inclusion. And so that looks like a lot of strategy work straddled across various sectors and industries, organizations, in small and large contexts as well.
No, that's great. It's such an important, conversation and strategy for organizations. So we really appreciate you being here and all your insight and your presentation. People are saying they've enjoyed it. So, and I enjoyed it. I always take away so many points from our speakers. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.